My phone buzzed at 11:47 in the morning, and that one short message changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. A neighbor I had not spoken to in months wrote, "Your parents are at your grandfather's house right now with two strangers and a clipboard." I was 3 hours into a double shift, sitting at my desk with a sandwich I never opened, my hands suddenly cold around a phone that felt heavier than it should. Until that moment, I had spent 10 long years believing my parents would never go that far, even on their worst day. 6 hours later, they would walk back into their own driveway with empty pockets and a fake deed in a torn envelope, and they would still find a way to blame me. Before I tell you what those strangers were holding and what my parents were trying to make my grandfather sign, I want you to do one small thing for me. Picture the person in your life who taught you what real loyalty looks like, the one who sat beside you when no one else did. Now picture the people who tried to take that person away from you in broad daylight. If you have ever loved someone the world tried to use against you, stay with me through this story, because what happened in that house was not just a theft, it was a quiet test, and what came after taught me something I should have understood years sooner. My name is Ackles, and I was 29 years old the day my parents drove two strangers up the narrow road to Cedar Hollow and stopped in front of the small white house where I had learned to ride a bike, learned to make pancakes, and learned what kind of person I wanted to be. The house belonged to my grandfather, Walter, and it had belonged to him for almost 50 years. He had paid it off slowly, working night shifts at the printing plant downtown, eating cold dinners alone at the kitchen table while my grandmother slept upstairs after her own long days. By the time he was 65, that house was the only thing in his life that had never let him down. By the time he was 78, with Parkinson's slowing his hands and a quiet shake in his voice, that house was the only place in the world where he still felt like himself. I want you to understand who my grandfather was, because if you understand him, you understand why what happened that day cut me deeper than anything had ever cut me before. He was not a loud man. He was the kind of man who fixed things instead of complaining about them. When the kitchen sink leaked, he got under it with a wrench. When the back gate sagged, he sanded it down and rehung it. When his only granddaughter showed up on his doorstep at age 9 with a small backpack and tears she was trying not to let anyone see, he made her a grilled cheese sandwich, set it down without saying a word, and then asked her if she wanted to learn how to play checkers. That was him. He moved slowly, but he moved sure, and he never made you feel like you were too much. I worked as a paralegal at a small estate law firm in town. The firm was run by a man named Mr. Halberg, who was 66, kind in a quiet way, and one of the best estate attorneys in the county. I had been with him for 6 years by then. I knew probate law better than most lawyers in our city. I knew the small print of trusts and the rules of power of attorney like I knew my own phone number. That detail will matter. Hold on to it. The morning everything cracked open, I had been at my desk since 7. Mr. Halberg had 2 filings due and a difficult client who kept rewriting her own will every other month. I was deep in a stack of paperwork when my phone buzzed against the desk. The number was not saved, but the area code was right. The message read, "This is Mrs. Pemberton from across the street. Honey, your parents are at Walter's house. They have 2 people with them. One is carrying a clipboard and one is taking pictures of the front. I do not want to bother you, but something feels off." For a second, I just stared at the words. My brain kept trying to rearrange them into something less ugly. Maybe my parents were checking on him. Maybe one of the strangers was a doctor. Maybe the person with the clipboard was a home health aide. I texted back, "What kind of pictures?" and waited. The little dots danced for a long time. Then she wrote, "The kind real estate people take. Outside, inside, the back, the roof. I just thought you should know." I did not stand up right away. I sat at my desk and looked at the framed picture beside my monitor, the one of my grandfather and me on the front porch of his house when I was 11. He had his arm around my shoulders. We were both squinting in the sun. I remember he had said that day, "You know, Ackles, this house is going to be yours someday, and I want you to fight for it the way I fought for it." I had laughed. I had said, "Grandpa, you are going to live forever." And he had laughed too and said, "No, but I plan to leave you ready." I picked up my phone and called him. He answered on the 4th ring, breathing heavy in the way he always did when he had been forced to walk fast. He said, "Hello, sweetheart." I said, "Grandpa, are Mom and Dad there?" There was a long pause. He said, "They are. They brought some friends." I asked him quietly, "What kind of friends?" He said, "I am not sure yet." The man with the camera asked me about the foundation. The lady with the clipboard asked me where my paperwork was. "I think your father is in the kitchen making coffee for them." I felt something cold slide down through my chest into my stomach. I said, "Grandpa, do not sign anything. Do you hear me? Not a single sheet of paper, even if your name is already on it, even if Dad puts it in front of you." He said, "I know, sweetheart. I am a slow old man, but I am not a stupid one. I am going to sit in my chair and I am going to keep my hands in my lap." Then he said, "Ackles, should I be afraid?" And that was the question that broke me, because I had to be honest and I had to be calm and I had to be both at the same time. I told him, no, you do not have to be afraid. I am coming home. Do not eat anything they bring you. Do not drink anything they pour. Just sit in your chair. I will be there in 25 minutes. He said, all right. I love you, Ackles. I said, I love you too, Grandpa. I am on my way. I told Mr. Halberg in 3 sentences. He stood up from his desk so fast that his chair rolled into the wall. He said, take the firm car, take my number, call me from the road. Do not engage your parents until I tell you what to say. I grabbed my bag, ran down the stairs, and got into the gray sedan in the lot. On the way out of the parking lot, I did 3 things at once. I called the local sheriff's non-emergency line and told them an elderly man in Cedar Hollow may be the target of financial exploitation by family members. They took my information. I called my best friend at the firm, a smart and steady woman named Jenna who handled most of our trust filings, and I asked her to pull every document related to my grandfather's estate. I needed it ready when I arrived. Then I called my brother Marcus. You need to know about Marcus before I tell you what he said. Marcus is 3 years younger than me. He has always been the favorite. Where I had to earn every grade by sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table and reading the same chapter 4 times, Marcus floated. Where I had to work 2 summer jobs to pay for my own community college courses, Marcus was given a car at 17 and a credit card at 18. Where my parents would say to me, Ackles, you are the responsible one and we are so glad we do not have to worry about you, they would say to Marcus, you have such a big heart, honey, the world is going to recognize you any day now. Marcus had been 26 years old for a year and he had still never paid a bill of his own. When Marcus picked up, he sounded like he had just rolled out of bed, which he probably had. I said, Marcus, are Mom and Dad at Grandpa's house? He said, oh yeah, I think so. I said, do you know who they brought with them? He paused. The pause was a half a second too long. He said, I think it is just some friends of Dad's. They are talking about, helping Grandpa figure out his finances. I said, Marcus, are you part of this? He said, part of what? I said, Marcus. He said, look, Ackles, do not get all dramatic. Mom said it was time. Grandpa is not getting any younger and somebody needs to think about, the future. We are family. We are supposed to talk about this stuff. I almost drove off the road. I did not yell. I had learned a long time ago that yelling at Marcus was like yelling at a cloud. Instead, I said, who is the man with the clipboard? Marcus said, I do not know his name. Hank, I think Hank something. Dad said he could move fast. I said, move fast on what? Marcus said, just, getting things ready. The house could use updating before any kind of transition. I said, transition to what? Marcus said, do not put words in my mouth, Ackles, I have to go, and he hung up. I want to tell you what I felt right then, but the truth is I did not feel one clean feeling. I felt 12 feelings stacked on top of each other like wet plates in a sink. I felt rage. I felt grief. I felt the old familiar tug to make peace, the trained reflex of being the oldest daughter, the one who fixes things, the one who makes the family look fine in front of the neighbors. I also felt, for the first time in my life, something new. I felt clarity. I felt cold, sharp, focused clarity, and I held on to it like a railing on a steep stairway. The drive from downtown to Cedar Hollow took 23 minutes if you hit the lights right. I hit them all green. I think the universe knew I needed to be there fast. As I drove, I thought back over the last 2 years, and the more I thought, the more I realized I had been watching my parents prepare for this without understanding. Gee, what I was seeing. It started with small things. 2 years ago, around the time my grandmother passed, my mother started visiting Grandpa more. That sounds like a good thing, but my mother does not visit anyone for free. She showed up with grocery bags she would later hint had cost her too much. She showed up with little gifts she would mention 3 times in one afternoon. She would say, Dad, do you know how much these blueberries cost? And Grandpa would smile and say, you did not have to do that, Diane. And she would say, well, somebody has to take care of you. The word somebody, when my mother used it, always meant somebody other than Ackles, even when Ackles was sitting right there. My father started showing up more too. He would say things like, Dad, this place is too much for you. You should think about something smaller. He would walk through the rooms and tap on walls and shake his head and say, this would all be so much easier if you let us handle it. Grandpa would just sit in his chair and say, I appreciate it, Ronald, but I am fine. My grandfather had a way of making no sound like the kindest yes in the world. About 14 months before that morning, my mother sat me down at her kitchen table. She made me a cup of tea I did not ask for. She said, Ackles, sweetheart, we need to talk about your grandfather. She said, your father and I are worried. We are worried about how confused he is getting. We are worried about how the bills are piling up. We are worried about, decisions that could go wrong. She said, we think it might be time for you to step back from being so involved. We will take it from here. We are his children after all. I sat there with that tea I did not want. I looked at her face and I knew, with the kind of knowing you cannot unknow, that the bills she was talking about were not piling up, that the confusion she was talking about was not real, and that her worry was not for him. I went home that night and I called Mr. Halberg and I asked him to meet with my grandfather and me at his office the following Saturday. I told him I needed to be sure that whatever my grandfather wanted, the law would protect. That Saturday, my grandfather and I sat across the desk from Mr. Halberg, and Grandpa told him exactly what he wanted. He wanted the house, the savings, and a small life insurance policy to go to me. He wanted a modest cash gift to go to Marcus, on the condition that Marcus first complete 1 full year of steady employment, verified in writing. He wanted nothing to go to my parents, not because he hated them, but because he had watched them, in his words, lose every dollar they had ever touched, and he did not want his last gift in this life to disappear into the same crack. Mr. Halberg looked at me carefully. He said, "Walter, do you understand that this will create conflict?" My grandfather looked at him just as carefully and said, "Sir, the conflict is already there. I am just deciding which side of it I want my granddaughter to be standing on when I am gone." We did not write a simple will. Mr. Halberg explained that a simple will can be challenged, slowed, fought, and dragged through probate for years. Instead, we built an irrevocable living trust. The house, the bank accounts, and a few other small assets were placed inside that trust. The trustee was Mr. Halberg himself, with me as the successor trustee. Once the documents were signed and notarized, even my grandfather could not change them. He had wanted it that way. He had said, "I want this thing locked so that no one can wear me down later." We made copies. We filed the proper notices with the county recorder. The deed of the house was retitled into the trust on a spring afternoon when the daffodils were just coming up around the front porch. We told no one, not my mother, not my father, not Marcus, not the cousins, not the neighbors. My grandfather had said, "Ackles, this is between you, me, the lawyer, and the Lord, and that is enough names for one secret." I had laughed. I had said, "Yes, sir." That was a year and a half before that Tuesday morning. So when I drove up the narrow road into Cedar Hollow with my hands tight on the wheel, I already knew something my parents did not know. They could not sell that house. They could not transfer that house. They could not borrow against that house. They could not do anything to that house, no matter what paper they put in front of my grandfather, because that house was not his to give anymore. It belonged to a trust, and the trust did not bend. I turned the corner onto Maple Street and saw the cars first. There were 3 of them in the driveway: my father's old silver pickup truck, my mother's white sedan, and a glossy black SUV with a vanity plate that read CASHNOW. I am not joking. CASHNOW. I felt my mouth go dry. I parked across the street in front of Mrs. Pemberton's mailbox. She was standing at her front window watching. She gave me a small, worried wave. I obeyed back. Then I walked up the lawn of my grandfather's house. The front door was open. Through the screen I could hear voices. My father's voice, hearty and forced, the way he sounded when he was trying to sell something. My mother's voice, light and careful, the way she sounded when she was trying to make a guest feel comfortable. A man's voice I did not know, faster, sharper, like a salesman in a hurry. And a woman's voice that was higher and louder than anyone else in the room. I stood on the porch for a moment, took a breath, and reminded myself of every single sentence Mr. Halberg had said before I left. Stay calm. Get names, get faces, get badges if they have them. Do not sign anything. Do not let your grandfather sign anything. Record if you can. Then he had said, "And Ackles, remember, the law is on your side. They just do not know it yet." I walked in. The first thing I saw was the kitchen table covered in papers, real estate papers, a glossy brochure with photos of homes printed on it, a clipboard with what looked like a transfer of deed form half filled out in pen. And in the middle of it all, sitting in his armchair across the room, was my grandfather, both hands folded carefully in his lap, his eyes meeting mine the moment I crossed the threshold. He gave me a small, slow nod. That nod said everything. It said I held the line. My mother saw me next. Her face did a thing I had seen 1,000 times. It folded into surprise, then anger, then a fast, fake smile. She said, "Oh, sweetheart, what are you doing home so early?" The man with the clipboard turned. He was maybe 40, in a too-tight suit with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said, "Oh, hi there, you must be the granddaughter. I'm Hank. I work with your folks. We are just getting some preliminary work done on the property." The woman beside him, taller, in a blazer that looked rented, said, "Hi, I am Rita. I am the realtor." I did not answer them. I walked past them. I crossed the room and I knelt next to my grandfather's chair and I put my hand over his hand. His fingers were trembling, but his eyes were dry. He said very softly, "I did not sign anything, Ackles." I said, "I know, Grandpa, I know." Then I stood up and I turned around and I looked at the 4 people in the kitchen and I said, in a voice that did not feel like mine, "Somebody is going to explain to me exactly what is happening in this house right now." My father cleared his throat. He said, "Ackles, do not make a scene." I said, "I am not making a scene, Dad. I am asking a question." He said, "Your grandfather is not in any condition to keep up this big house anymore. We are just trying to help him plan ahead. We are family. This is what family does." I looked at the clipboard. I said, "May I see that document?" Hank pulled it back toward his chest. He said, "Oh, this is just a working draft. We are not at the signing stage yet." I said, "Then there is no harm in me looking at it." I held out my hand. He hesitated. He looked at my father. My father looked at my mother. My mother said, "Sweetie, you are getting yourself worked up." I said, "Mom, hand me the clipboard." My father took it from Hank and put it on the table. He said, "Ackles, sit down, let us talk." I did not sit down. I picked up the top sheet. It was a quitclaim deed, which is a one-page legal document used to transfer ownership of property fast. The grantor, the person giving up ownership, was listed as Walter Bradshaw. The grantee, the person receiving ownership, was a small business name I did not recognize, Ackles Holdings LLC. The price listed for the transfer was $12,000, for a house worth at least $420,000. The signature line at the bottom was empty, but next to it in pencil in my father's slanted handwriting was a small note. It said, "Walter signs here." I felt the room go still around me. I read the page twice. Then I looked up. I said, "Dad." He said, "Look, Ackles, before you misunderstand, let me explain. Hank is going to take care of the heavy lifting. He's going to do all the cleanup and the repairs and resell the property, and Grandpa gets to walk away with cash in hand and not have to worry about a thing." I said, $12,000. He said, "It is not really 12, that is just a placeholder for tax purposes. The real arrangement is more complicated." I said, "Dad, this is a quitclaim deed for $12,000 signed over to a man none of us have ever met before today. I am not stupid." My mother said, "Watch your tone, Ackles. I am not stupid either, and I will not be spoken to that way in this house." I said, "This is not your house, Mom." She said, "Excuse me." I said, "This is not your house. This was never your house." My father said, "Ackles, that is enough." I turned to Hank. I said, "Hank, are you a licensed real estate broker in this state?" He said, "Well, I work with brokers." I said, "That is not what I asked you. I asked you if you are licensed." He said, "I do not need to be technically for an LLC purchase." I said, "Rita, are you a licensed realtor in this state?" She said, "I have a license in another state, but you know, real estate is real estate." I said, "What is your license number?" She said, "I do not have it on me." I said, "What is the name of your brokerage?" She named a brokerage that I happened to know had closed 2 years ago because a former client of ours had filed a complaint against it. I pulled out my phone. I put it on the kitchen table, screen up, and I tapped the record button. I said, "This is Tuesday, August 22nd. I am Ackles Bradshaw. I am at the home of my grandfather, Walter Bradshaw. Present in this room are Ronald Bradshaw, Diane Bradshaw, a man identifying himself as Hank, last name unstated, and a woman identifying herself as Rita, last name unstated. There is a quitclaim deed on the table prepared in pencil to transfer the property at this address from Walter Bradshaw to a business named Ackles Holdings LLC for the price of $12,000. My grandfather has not signed it. He has told me he does not wish to sign it." Hank stood up. He said, "I do not consent to being recorded." I said, "This is a one-party consent state. You do not have to consent." He said, "This has gone out of hand. I am going to leave." I said, "You are welcome to leave. Hank, before you go, I need you to know that you have come into the home of an elderly man with Parkinson's with a paper drawn up to take ownership of his primary residence for a fraction of its market value with his children present, and that this is being recorded. You may want to consult with your own counsel about what we just witnessed." Rita grabbed her purse. She said, "I did not know about any of this. I am out." She walked out the front door so fast her heels skidded on the porch step. Hank picked up his clipboard. He said to my father, "I told you this was supposed to be smooth." My father said it was supposed to be. Hank said, "Well, it is not. I want my deposit back, Ronald." I said, "I am sorry. What deposit?" Nobody answered. Hank walked out without another word. The black SUV with the CASHNOW plate started up and roared down the street. The kitchen was suddenly very quiet. My grandfather had not moved from his chair. My mother had her hand over her mouth. My father was breathing heavily and staring at the table. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and I said, "The deposit." "What deposit?" There was a long silence. Then my father said, "Look, we had to put up something. Hank does not work for free. We had to pay him to come out and assess and do the paperwork." I said, "How much?" He said, "A few thousand." I said, "Dad, how much?" He said, "It does not matter, Ackles. The deal was going to make all of it back 10 times over." I said, "How much?" My mother said, $22,000. I felt my face go cold. $22,000. I sat down at the kitchen table across from my grandfather and I asked the question I should have asked a long time ago. I said, "Where did that money come from?" My father said, "We used the equity line on our house. We can pay it back with the proceeds." I said, "The proceeds you were going to get from selling Grandpa's house." He did not answer. I said, "Dad, did you take out a second mortgage on your house to pay a stranger to help you steal your father's house?" My mother said, "That is an ugly word, Ackles." I said, "But it is the right one." My grandfather in his quiet voice said, "I would like to know why." My father turned. My mother lowered her hand from her mouth. My father said, "Dad, it is not. Look, it was supposed to be a clean deal. We were going to give you cash, you were going to be more comfortable, we were going to take care of the rest." My grandfather said, "You do not have a key to my house, Ronald. How did you get in?" My father said, "You let us in." You opened the door, my grandfather said. I let in my son. I did not let in two strangers and a clipboard. I want to pause the story right here for a second. I want you to picture my grandfather. Picture this man with shaking hands and tired eyes and a heart that had carried more weight in his life than any of us would ever fully understand. Picture him sitting in the same chair he had been buying off and on at thrift stores and replacing one piece at a time for 40 years, looking at his only son, and saying, "You brought strangers into my house to take it from me." There is a kind of betrayal that does not need yelling because the silence around it is louder than any voice could ever be. I watched my father's whole body sag. He said, "Dad, it was not like that." My grandfather said, "Then how was it?" My father said nothing. My mother said, "Walter, please, please understand, we are drowning. Ronald lost his job 4 months ago. We have been keeping it from everyone because we were ashamed. We were not trying to hurt you. We were trying to fix our own life," my grandfat her said, "by selling mine." The room was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming. I want to be honest with you. In that moment I almost felt bad for them. I almost felt the old pull. The pull that said they are hurting, they are scared, they made a bad choice, they are still your parents. That pull is the strongest pull in the world for a daughter who has spent her whole life being told it is her job to keep the family from breaking. But then I looked at my grandfather and I saw the fear that had not yet left his eyes, and I remembered the pencil mark on the deed that said Walter signs here, and I remembered the words my mother had said to me at her kitchen table 14 months ago when she had told me to step back. And the pull let me go. I stood up. I said, "Mom, Dad, you both need to leave. I will take care of Grandpa. We will deal with what just happened, but you need to leave this house right now." My father said, "Ackles, do not do this. We can talk it through." I said, "You are welcome to talk it through with our lawyer." My mother said, "Our lawyer? What lawyer?" I said, "The lawyer who manages Grandpa's estate. The same lawyer who handled the trust." My father said, "The trust? What trust?" I had been waiting all my life to see my parents' faces in that exact second. I do not say that proudly. I am just telling you the truth. I said, "The irrevocable living trust that my grandfather signed 18 months ago, naming Mr. Hallberg as the trustee and me as the successor trustee. The trust that holds the title to this house. The trust that no one in this room except me and my grandfather has the legal right to even discuss. The trust that means that even if my grandfather had signed that paper today, that paper would have been worthless because he was not the legal owner of this house anymore. The owner is the trust, and the trust is locked." The color drained out of my mother's face so fast it was like watching a window shade drop. My father sat down hard on a kitchen chair. He said, "You are lying." I said, "I am not." He said, "You would not." He turned to my grandfather. He said, "Dad, tell her she is lying." My grandfather very calmly said, "She is not lying, son. I did it on purpose. I did not want any of this to happen, and I knew if I did not lock it down, all of this was going to happen anyway. I am sorry, Ronald." My father just stared at the floor. My mother put one hand on the back of a chair to steady herself. She said, "But you took out the loan without saying anything to him." My father did not answer. She said, "Ronald." He said nothing. She said, "Ronald, did you not check? Did you not check that the title? Did you not? Oh my God." Then she sank into a chair too, and the two of them sat across from each other, not looking at each other, not speaking, while my grandfather and I watched. I said, "Mom, Dad, you brought a man into this house with a fake brokerage and a quitclaim deed. You paid him $22,000 from a loan that you took out against your own house, and you did all of this without first checking whether Grandpa was even in a legal position to sell. You did this because you did not want to know. You did this because if you had asked anyone, you would have been told, and then you could not have pretended later that you had not known." My mother said, "Ackles, please, please do not call the police." I said, "I am not calling the police yet. I am calling our lawyer, and I am calling Adult Protective Services because that is what you call when an elderly man is targeted in a financial crime by his own family. After that, what happens next will depend on what they tell me." My father raised his head. He said, "Ackles, please, we are your parents." I said, "You are, and he is my grandfather. And on this day, in this house, you both made me choose, and I am choosing him." I called Mr. Hallberg from the back porch. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "Ackles, I am going to drive over right now. Do not let them leave with anything that is not theirs. Do not let them touch the table again. Stay calm." He arrived 22 minutes later in his old gray suit and his careful, kind face. He took the paperwork into custody. He photographed everything. He took down Hank's full name from the LLC paperwork left on the table, which turned out to be Hank Lyle Brennan, a man with 3 prior complaints filed with the state attorney's office. He took my recording. He told my parents in a voice that was not unkind but was very firm that they were now both legally on notice, and that any further contact with my grandfather without my presence would be considered harassment of a vulnerable adult, and would be reported. My mother started to cry. My father did not cry. He just looked very, very tired. Mr. Hallberg said, "Ronald, Diane, I have known your daughter for 6 years. I have known your father for the last 2. I have to tell you what you tried to do, Toda. Why is one of the worst things I have ever seen in this profession, and I have seen some bad ones." He said, "You are lucky that the trust was already in place. If it had not been, this would already be a criminal case. As it is, it may still become one. That is not my decision. That is the decision of the people whose job it is to decide." He said, "Please go home, we will be in touch." They went home, but they did not go home to peace. By the time they pulled into their driveway in the late afternoon, with the long shadow of an oak tree falling over their porch, they had spent $22,000 on a man who was, at that very moment, packing his car in another part of town to disappear from his rented apartment. Hank Brennan was a scammer who specialized in elderly homeowners with desperate adult children. He took deposits to handle quick cash sales, and then the moment things got complicated, he vanished. He was not a real estate professional, he was barely a real person. The brokerage Rita had named had been closed for years. Rita herself, we would later learn, was Hank's girlfriend, paid $200 in cash to wear a blazer for the afternoon and call herself a realtor. The $22,000 was gone. Hank had taken it in a wire transfer 2 weeks before. He never refunded it. His phone was disconnected by the next day. He did not respond to any further messages. But that was not the worst of it for my parents. The worst of it was the loan they had taken out against their house. They had used a home equity line of credit to access the cash. That meant their house, their own house, was now carrying a $30,000 additional debt because they had also paid off some of their existing credit cards with part of the loan. The bank wanted payments. The bank did not care that the deal had fallen through. The bank did not care that they had been scammed. The bank cared that the line was open and that it was due. My father had not been working steadily for almost 5 months. He had a freelance contract that came and went, and my mother worked part-time at a clothing store. They had thought in their minds that they would pay this whole thing back inside 90 days, the moment they sold Grandpa's house. They had been so sure of that plan that they had not even considered what would happen if it did not work. It did not work. I learned all of this not because I tried to. I learned it the way you learn family things in pieces from people who slip. Marcus called me that same night. Marcus, the golden child, the one who had lost his nerve when I called him in the morning. Marcus called me at 9:45 and he was crying. I had never heard my brother cry before. He said, "Ackles, I am so sorry." I said, "What did you do, Marcus?" He said, I knew about all of it. They told me a month ago. They told me I would get a cut. They said you would never know. They said it was going to be quick. They said Grandpa was confused enough that he would just sign without really reading. They said it was for the best. He said, "I should have told you. I knew you were the one taking care of him, and I let them sit at my kitchen table and tell me it was all going to be fine." I sat on my couch in the small living room of my own apartment, which I rented because I had been saving aggressively for a down payment on a place of my own, and I listened to my brother cry. I felt the strangest thing. I felt no anger toward him. I just felt tired. I said, "Marcus, why are you telling me this now?" He said, "Because Mom and Dad lost the deposit. They are saying it is your fault. They are saying you ruined everything. They are saying you tricked Grandpa into signing the trust behind their backs." He said, "I needed to tell you the truth before you only heard their version." I said, "Marcus, did Mom say I tricked Grandpa?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Marcus, did Dad say it too?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Marcus, do you believe them?" There was a long pause. He said, "No." I said, "Then say so out loud to them. Because if you keep nodding along while they rewrite this, you will be the next person I cannot trust, and I do not have many left." He said, "Okay." He said it with a small voice, but he said it. We hung up. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my couch with a cup of tea I never drank, and I watched the headlights of cars pass across the wall. I thought about my grandfather, who I had moved in with that night for the time being, in his upstairs guest room. I thought about how, when I had finally gotten him into bed, he had reached up and put one trembling hand on the side of my face, and he had said, "Ackles, I am sorry, I am the kind of grandfather whose family does this." I had said, "Grandpa, you are the only kind of grandfather I want." The next 2 weeks were very strange. The world did not stop. I still had work. Mr. Halberg gave me a few days off, but I did not want to sit at home because the silence was worse than the work. I went back into the office. I closed cases. I made phone calls. I drafted documents. I made my grandfather his usual breakfast every morning, which was 2 soft eggs, 1 slice of toast, and black coffee. I drove to his physical therapy appointments. I balanced his checkbook on Sunday afternoons. But under all of that, the family pressure had begun. Started with my Aunt Joyce, my father's older sister. She lived 3 states away. She called me on a Thursday evening. She said, "Ackles, sweetheart, I just heard about everything. I am so sorry you are caught in the middle." I said, "I am not in the middle, Aunt Joyce. I am at the receiving end." She paused. She said, "Well, sweetheart, I just want to say your parents are devastated. They did not mean any harm. They were just trying to help your grandfather plan ahead, and things got out of hand." I said, "Aunt Joyce, did they tell you about the quitclaim deed for $12,000? There was a longer pause. She said, "Well, that is not what they told me." I said, "I have a copy. Would you like to see it?" She did not. She said, "Ackles, please, I am asking as your aunt, please do not let this become a legal thing. Forgive them. We are family." I said, Aunt Joyce, with respect, family is what my grandfather and I were. Family is what they tried to take. I will not be cruel, but I will not pretend. She told me I was being hard. I told her she was welcome to come spend a weekend in town and see the situation for herself. She did not come. After Joyce, my mother's sister called, then a cousin I had not heard from in 3 years called, then a family friend. Each one told me a slightly softer version of the same sentence. Forgive them, they did not mean it. You are tearing the family apart. You are being too cold. You are being too lawyer-like. You are being too proud. I noticed something during those calls. Not one of them asked how my grandfather was doing. That was the moment the last little piece of the old version of me died. Not in a dramatic way, just a quiet click, the kind of click you hear when a lock turns in a door. I realized that for the rest of my life, the people who would call me cold for protecting my grandfather were the same people who would never lift a finger to protect him themselves. I realized that the role I had played for 30 years, the patient, quiet, dependable daughter, the keeper of the family peace, had not been a role I chose. It had been a role I had been cast in by people who needed somebody to absorb their mess. I was done being the one who absorbed. I made a list. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and I made a list of every person who had called me to ask me to be softer. Then I made a list of every person who had called me to ask if my grandfather was okay. The first list was 9 names long. The second list had 2 names on it, Mr. Halberg and Mrs. Pemberton from across the street. I taped both lists to the inside of my pantry door. I kept them there for a long time. They reminded me, on the days I almost folded, who had actually shown up. 3 weeks after the day of the clipboard, my parents came to my apartment. They did not call first. They knocked. My mother had her purse held in front of her like a small shield. My father had on his good jacket. I let them in, but I did not offer them anything to drink. My mother said, Ackles, we want to apologize. I said, all right. She said, we are sorry. We were under so much stress. We did not see it clearly. We made a mistake. I said, Mom, you did not make a mistake. A mistake is when you do something you would not have done if you had been thinking clearly. You thought about this for months. You met with that man for weeks before that day. You took out a loan. You waited until I was at work. You pulled my brother into it and asked him to lie to me. That is not a mistake. That is a plan that did not survive contact with the truth. My father said, Ackles, you are not wrong. I am not going to argue with you. We did wrong. We will own it. But sweetie, we are in trouble, real trouble. We have a payment due in 2 weeks on the equity line and we cannot make it. If we miss it, we will start to lose the house. We are coming to ask not for forgiveness, not yet, but for help. He said, just enough to keep us afloat for a few months. I want to tell you, I sat with that question for a long time before I answered it. It is one thing to set a boundary in a story. It is another thing to set a boundary across a kitchen table from your own father when his face is gray and his voice is breaking, and you know that whatever you say next will follow you for the rest of your life. I thought about my grandfather upstairs in his bed. I thought about what he had told me all those years ago on the porch in the sun. I thought about the $22,000 they had handed to a stranger in cash to take him out of his own home. I said, Dad, the answer is no. He flinched. I said, I am not going to use Grandpa's money to bail out the people who tried to take Grandpa's house. I am not going to use my own savings either. I have worked very hard for what I have, and I have already done my part. He said, Ackles, please, we will lose the house. I said, Dad, I am sorry. I am truly sorry, but you took out that loan to take his house. You did not take it out for groceries. You did not take it out for medicine. You took it out to remove him from his life. The fact that the plan failed does not mean that the people he loves now owe you the cost of the plan. My mother started to cry. She said, you are so cold, Ackles. I said, Mom, no, I am not cold. I am just finally clear. There is a difference. She said, your grandfather would not want this. I said, Mom, do not put words in his mouth. Not after what you tried to do. I will tell you what my grandfather wants. He wants to live the rest of his years in his own home in peace with his only granddaughter. That is the only thing he has asked for in 2 years. They left. The walk from my couch to the door was short, but it felt very long. After they were gone, I locked the door and I leaned my forehead against it and I cried for about a minute. Then I washed my face and I drove back to my grandfather's house and I made him spaghetti and meat sauce for dinner. He put on an old record. We did not talk much. We did not have to. Things did not get easier right away. My parents lost the equity line first. Then a few weeks later they fell behind on their primary mortgage because the equity line had been eating their cash flow before things got really bad. My father had to sell his pickup. My mother sold a string of pearls that her own mother had left her. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment by the highway. They did not invite anyone over. Marcus, to my surprise, got a real job at a warehouse. He started paying his own bills for the first time in his life. He came over to my grandfather's house once a week for dinner. He did not talk much about our parents. He did show up. The other relatives, the ones who had told me to soften, mostly stopped calling. That was a strange relief. The phone got quiet. Aunt Joyce sent me a Christmas card with no note. I sent her one back with no note. We understood each other. My grandfather and I lived together in his house for the next 2 years. I rented out my apartment. I drove him to his appointments. I took him to a high school football game on a cold October Friday because he had played in that same stadium when he was 15 and he wanted to see the field one more time. I sat next to him on the bleachers in a wool coat and I held his hand and I felt grateful for every minute. He passed in his sleep on a Sunday morning in early spring. The daffodils were just coming up around the porch, the same way they had been the day we signed the trust. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee when I noticed how quiet the upstairs had become. I climbed the stairs slowly. I opened the door. He looked peaceful. His hand was on his chest. I sat on the edge of his bed and I put my hand on his hand and I told him thank you. I told him thank you for the grilled cheese sandwich. I told him thank you for the porch. I told him thank you for the trust. I told him thank you for not asking me to choose silence over truth, even when I had been raised to think silence was love. The funeral was small. The church was old and tall. I gave the eulogy. My parents were in the third row. They cried. I did not say a single mean thing about them in the eulogy. I did not have to. I did not even need to mention that day. The whole town remembered who had been at the hospital with him and who had not. The whole town remembered who had driven him to physical therapy in the rain and who had not. Towns remember. That is the thing about small towns. You can lie all you want and they will let you, but they do not forget. 3 weeks after the funeral, the trust opened. The house transferred to me cleanly, exactly as my grandfather had wanted, with no probate and no fight. The savings transferred too. The small life insurance policy paid out and went into a separate account I labeled in my own handwriting in a small notebook the porch fund. Marcus received his cash gift, the modest one Grandpa had set aside for him, on the condition that Marcus had completed 1 full year of steady employment, which he had. He deposited it into a savings account and did not touch it for a long time. My parents received nothing. There was nothing to receive. The trust said what it said. The law said what it said. There was no will to fight, no probate to delay. The estate moved as if it had been a piece of clockwork because it had been built that way. They did not call me for 9 months. The first time they did, my mother left a voicemail. She said, "Ackles, your father has been working at the hardware store and I am back at the clothing store full time. We are slowly digging out. I just wanted to say we know we lost a lot more than money that day. We lost you and we lost your grandfather and we lost something we did not even know we had until it was gone. We are not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know." I called her back 2 days later. I did not promise her anything. I told her, "Mom, I am willing to talk slowly in small pieces with no expectations." I told her I am not willing to pretend. She said, "Ackles, I would not ask you to pretend." I said, "Then we can start there." We met for coffee, just the two of us, on a Saturday morning in a small place downtown. We talked for an hour. She did not try to defend that day. She did not try to explain it away. She said, "I think I was a person who needed to believe I had been a good mother more than I needed to actually be one, and that is the hardest thing I have ever had to admit out loud." I sat across from her in that coffee shop and I did not feel triumph. I felt sadness. The kind of sadness that comes when something has been broken so cleanly that even the people who broke it can finally see it for what it was. I am not telling you that we became close. We did not. We became careful. There is a difference. Careful is not warm, but careful is honest. Careful is the most that some families ever get to, and after a certain kind of injury, careful is more than enough. My father took longer. We did not speak for almost 2 years after the day of the clipboard. The first time we did, he came up to me at the hardware store where he worked in his apron with his name tag on his chest, and he said, "Ackles." I bought a small set of drawer pulls I had been meaning to install in my grandfather's, now my, kitchen. I put them on the counter. He rang them up. He said that house always had good light. I said, "It still does, Dad." He said, "I am sorry. I am sorry for what I tried to do. I am sorry for who I was that day." I said, "I know, Dad." He blinked very fast, like a man who was not used to speaking truthfully. He said, "I do not deserve to come over." I said, "No, you do not, not yet. Maybe someday. I do not know yet." He said, "I understand." He gave me my receipt. He said, "The drawer pulls go in clockwise. They are tricky if you are not paying attention." I said, "Thank you, Dad." I drove home. The pulls were tricky, but I got them in. I sat at my grandfather's kitchen table with my hands smelling like the metal of new hardware, and I cried for about 10 minutes. Then I made myself a grilled cheese sandwich, the way my grandfather had taught me, with a little bit of butter on both sides of the bread and the heat low. I sat with it. I ate slowly. I thought about how funny it was that the place where everything had nearly been taken from me had become the place I felt the safest in the world. I want to tell you what I learned through all of this, because if you have stayed with me this long, you deserve more than a story. You deserve the lesson the story bought. I learned that families who use you do not stop on their own. They stop only when there is a wall. They stop only when the wall does not move. They will tell you that the wall is cruel. They will tell you that a softer person would not have built it. They will send other people to come and tell you the same thing. Each one of those messengers will sound very kind, and each one of those messengers will be wrong. The wall is not cruel. The wall is the only thing that lets the love that is left have somewhere safe to live. I learned that paperwork is love. People do not say that, but it is true. The trust my grandfather signed was not a cold legal thing. The trust was a love letter written in legal language. The trust said, I see what is coming and I am going to step in front of it before it arrives because I love you and I do not want you fighting your own family in a courtroom for the only home I ever owned. I have a copy of that trust in a fireproof folder on a shelf in his old study. I take it out sometimes when I miss him. I read it like a poem. It is the best poem in our family. I learned that quiet revenge is not really revenge at all. The people who tried to take from me lost everything they had touched, and I did not have to lift a finger. I did not curse them. I did not destroy them. I did not even speak ill of them. I just told the truth calmly in front of a witness with the law in my corner. The rest of the consequences came on their own, the way water finds the lowest point. That is the only kind of revenge a person should ever spend any time on. The kind that is just truth set free. I learned that the people who love you most will sometimes be the ones who teach you the most painful lessons. My grandfather did not save me by being a hero. He saved me by being prepared. He saved me by spending one boring Saturday in a lawyer's office signing his name to pieces of paper that he could have just as easily ignored. He saved me by trusting me with the secret and by trusting Mr. Halberg to do his job and by understanding, when so many of his generation never did, that the law is a tool, not a betrayal, when family becomes the betrayal first. And I learned finally that the greatest victory is not the moment you win. The greatest victory is the moment you realize you are not afraid of losing anymore. I had spent my whole life afraid of losing my parents' love. I had spent my whole life afraid of being the daughter who said no. The day I said no in my own apartment, across from my own father with my own voice, was the day I stopped being afraid. After that day, no one in my family has ever spoken to me the way they used to. Some of them did the work of changing. Some of them disappeared. Both of those outcomes are okay. I made room for what is real and I let go of what was not. The house in Cedar Hollow is still standing. The daffodils still come up every spring around the porch. I live there full time now. I painted the front door a deep green, which my grandfather always said he had wanted to do but never got around to. I planted tomatoes in the side yard. I keep a checkers set on the coffee table, even though I do not play with anyone anymore. Sometimes Marcus comes over on Sundays and we play a slow game and we do not talk about what happened, and the silence feels different than it used to. It feels like a house remembering. A few months ago, on a quiet afternoon, I was cleaning out the upstairs closet when I found a small, sealed envelope tucked behind a row of old boxes. It had my name on the front in my grandfather's careful handwriting. I sat down on the floor and opened it. Inside was a single index card. On the card he had written, "Ackles, if you're reading this, you held the line. I am proud of you. The house is yours. You are not alone. Love, Grandpa." I sat on the floor of that closet for a very long time. I held the card to my chest. I cried, the kind of crying that does not hurt, the kind that only comes when something has finally landed exactly where it is supposed to land. If you have a person in your life who taught you what loyalty really feels like, the kind of person who quietly, year after year, kept showing up, I want you to do me one favor. I want you to call them this week, or write them, or visit them. Do not wait until something happens. Do not wait until someone tries to take them away from you. Tell them now. Sit with them now. Eat a grilled cheese sandwich at their kitchen table now. Listen to their stories now, even the ones you have heard 100 times, because one day you will give anything to hear those stories again, and they will only live in your memory. And if you have people in your life who are circling, the way I had people circling, who only show up when there is something to take, I want you to know something. You do not owe them softness. You do not owe them another chance. You do not owe them the version of you who used to be afraid. You are allowed to be the one who finally builds the wall. You are allowed to be the one who reads the paperwork. You are allowed to be the one who asks the hard question across the kitchen table. Love that survives the truth is the only kind of love worth keeping. Everything else is just a deal you have not finished bleeding for yet. The day my parents tried to steal my grandfather's house was, on paper, the worst day of my life. But it was also, in a way I did not see at the time, the day my real life began. Until that day I had been living a life in which I had to prove I was lovable by absorbing other people's mistakes. After that day I started living a life in which the people who loved me did not need me to absorb anything. They just needed me to be there, and I did the same for them. And that, I have come to believe, is the only kind of family worth fighting for. My grandfather built a house, then he built a trust, then he built me, and on the worst day of my life, all three of those things held. That is the story. I am Ackles. The house is still mine. The daffodils are coming up. The door is still green. And the people who tried to take it from me are, last I heard, slowly paying back a loan they never should have taken out in a small 2-bedroom apartment by the highway where they have, I have been told, started telling the truth to themselves at last. I do not visit. I do not refuse either if invited carefully. I am learning slowly what kind of relationship is possible after that kind of injury, and I am letting it be whatever it turns out to be instead of forcing it to be more or less than it is. I think that might be the deepest lesson of all. After the betrayal, you do not have to know exactly what comes next. You just have to refuse to go backward. You just have to keep choosing the version of yourself who held the line. I held the line. You can too. If you made it all the way to the end, I won. To ask you something, and I really want you to answer in the comments, because this is the kind of question that helps people who are still inside the storm. If you had been Ackles that morning, sitting at your desk with that sandwich you never opened, watching that message come in from a neighbor you barely knew, what would you have done first, and who in your own life is the person who taught you what loyalty really looks like? Tell me about them. Say their name out loud here in this space where strangers will read it and quietly nod, because we have all had a Grandpa Walter and we have all had a clipboard. And we are all learning together that the wall we build is not the end of love, it is the place where the love that is left finally gets to stand up straight.